When a flight attendant rudely insulted an old black man in the economy class, she thought she was asserting her authority. But when the plane landed, she discovered a shocking truth. The old man was actually the owner of the airline. What happens next becomes the most unforgettable lesson of her life. Before we dive into the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss more inspiring tales. The old, worn out taxi crawled to a stop in front of the airport gates, rattling slightly as it came to rest. The morning buzz at the airport was in full swing, with streams of travelers hurrying about, pulling their suitcases behind them as they rushed to complete their check in procedures. From the taxi's door emerged an elderly man, moving with deliberate calm. He wore a faded shirt and threadbare trousers, paired with well worn shoes whose scuffed soles spoke of many long journeys. Carefully, he lifted a small, time worn suitcase, its age a mirror of his own, and gently shut the taxi door. Before departing, he turned toward the driver, offering a kind smile and a heartfelt thank you. The driver nodded in acknowledgement, his face warm with genuine regard, but the urgency of other vehicles honking nearby forced him to drive away quickly. The elderly man stood for a moment, his gaze leisurely sweeping across the bustling scene before him. Unlike the hurried, frantic passengers around him, he moved with an unhurried grace, as though he were savoring the moment or waiting for something unspoken. After a few breaths, he gripped his suitcase firmly and walked into the airport's main hall. The vast terminal was bathed in natural light streaming through enormous glass windows, reflecting brilliantly off the polished stone floors. Uniformed staff moved briskly to assist travelers, while the overhead speakers continually broadcast announcements. The old man joined the line at the check-in counter, his modest attire and composed demeanor making him an anomaly amidst the sharply dressed men, elegant women in designer gowns, and high-end luggage adorning the other passengers. Some glanced at him with a mix of curiosity and subtle disdain. A young woman in an expensive fur coat brushed past him, pulling her gleaming designer suitcase with a wrinkled nose, quickening her steps as though his presence might somehow taint her. Unperturbed by the sideways glances, the old man maintained his calm composure. When it was his turn, he placed his flight ticket and ID on the counter. Across from him stood Clara Evans, a woman in her early 30s. Her neatly tied brown hair and piercing gaze gave her an air of precision and authority. The impeccably tailored uniform she wore only added to her commanding presence. Clara lifted her head from the computer screen, her sharp eyes darting over the old man, her expression betraying the judgment forming in her mind. "Are you sure you bought the right ticket?" Clara asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Economy class, right? Or was the ticket gifted to you by someone?" Her words lacked any trace of courtesy, instead laced with sarcasm and a faint trace of contempt. The old man didn't respond immediately. He simply offered a faint smile, nodded politely, and nudged the ticket closer to her. Clara scanned the ticket, letting out an audible sigh of annoyance, making no effort to mask her impatience. "Fine," she said curtly, handing the ticket back. "Here's your seat, near the restroom. Perfect for you." Her smirk, barely veiled, was heavy with mockery and disdain. The old man took the ticket without complaint, offering a soft "thank you" before walking away. He showed no signs of offense or irritation, as though her words had rolled off him like water off a rock. Clara watched him retreat for a brief moment before dismissing him with a shrug, turning her attention to the next passenger in line. The old man maintained his calm demeanor, softly thanking Clara before taking the ticket and walking away. He offered no complaints, no resistance, as if everything that had just transpired had nothing to do with him. Clara watched him walk away, shrugging indifferently before turning her attention to the next passenger. The old man passed through the security checkpoint at a leisurely pace. Initially, the security personnel eyed him cautiously, likely judging him by his modest appearance. However, upon examining his documents and noticing his polite manner, they quickly waved him through without issue. Walking down the long corridor leading to the boarding gate, he eventually found his assigned seat, a narrow one near the window in the last row, just as Clara had said. Surrounding him were other economy class passengers, mostly laborers or small families. A young mother seated nearby was struggling to soothe her crying toddler. When she noticed the old man taking his seat, she gave him a tired nod, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The old man responded with a warm smile, his presence radiating quiet reassurance. Once all the passengers had settled into their seats, Clara emerged from the front of the cabin to begin her duties. Her expression brightened noticeably as she approached the first class section. Her smile was wide, her tone honeyed as she addressed the affluent travelers. "Welcome aboard today's flight. We hope you have a truly exceptional experience," she said, her voice dripping with charm. However, as she stepped into the economy section, the welcoming facade disappeared. Her face turned cold, and a furrow formed on her brow as her gaze swept over the rows of ordinary passengers. The old man sat quietly in his seat, observing Clara discreetly. He said nothing, but his eyes held a certain curiosity, as if he were studying her every move. Clara approached his row, dropping a tray of food onto the table in front of him with an audible thud, not even sparing him a glance. "Here's your meal. Eat quickly," she said, her tone detached, bordering on commanding. The old man inclined his head slightly in thanks, maintaining his composed demeanor as always. Clara smirked and pivoted sharply, striding away and leaving behind an air of discomfort. In the economy cabin, quiet murmurs began to spread. Some passengers couldn't help but notice Clara's dismissive attitude, but no one dared to speak up. Each person seemed to choose silence, as if trying to avoid becoming her next target. The old man remained in his seat, his eyes gleaming with patience, as though he were well acquainted with situations like this. As the flight settled into a steady rhythm, Clara began her duty of serving drinks to the passengers. The sound of the beverage cart's wheels rolling smoothly down the aisle mixed with the low hum of the airplane in flight. Clara stood tall, her hands deftly arranging cups and small bottles of water on the cart. However, her face no longer held the welcoming smile she had shown earlier. The first-class passengers had already received her utmost attention and care, but as she stepped into the economy cabin, her expression shifted, revealing a thinly veiled disdain. Starting from the first row of the economy section, Clara offered passengers drink choices in a perfunctory manner, her words clipped and devoid of warmth. When, when she reached Charles's row, her eyes momentarily betrayed a flicker of annoyance. "What do you need?" she asked curtly, making no effort to conceal her impatience. Charles looked up, his face calm and composed. "Just a glass of water, please." "Thank you," he replied softly. Clara nodded indifferently, but instead of promptly fetching his water, she turned to serve the passenger seated across the aisle. Charles remained seated, silent and patient. Once she had finished attending to the others, Clara finally returned with a glass of water in her hand. Instead of placing it gently on the tray table, she let it drop with a loud clatter. "Here, drink it quickly," she said, like her tone utterly devoid of courtesy. Charles offered a small, polite smile and inclined his head in thanks. Clara, however, had already turned on her heel, walking away without so much as a glance back. Her rudeness did not go unnoticed by the passengers seated nearby. A middle-aged woman seated directly behind Charles shook her head slightly, her expression clearly reflecting disapproval. As Clara moved further down the aisle, another situation unfolded. An older passenger, also a man of color, politely asked for help in placing his suitcase into the overhead bin. The man, frail and visibly lacking the strength to do it himself, made his request with utmost respect. However, Clara stopped, still holding her tray of drinks, and let out an exaggerated sigh. "If you can't do it yourself, why didn't you bring someone to help you? This isn't my job," she said flatly, her voice cold. The man froze, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to lift the suitcase. Charles, sitting a few rows away, couldn't remain silent any longer. Rising from his seat, he approached the man with a gentle smile. "Let me help you," he said kindly. Though Charles's age was not far off from the struggling passenger, he effortlessly lifted the suitcase and placed it securely in the overhead bin. Clara stood with arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a scornful expression. When Charles returned to his seat, she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, how noble of you. Maybe you should consider applying for a job as a baggage handler instead of meddling in my work." Charles remained unfazed, his calm gaze meeting hers. "Helping others is never meddling. he said quietly but firmly, his tone carrying an air of quiet dignity. Several passengers around them nodded in agreement, their expressions supportive. Clara, however, smirked and rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath as she pushed her cart further down the aisle. The tension in the cabin lingered, and the old man's quiet yet decisive actions left a mark on everyone who had witnessed the exchange. Clara stood still, arms crossed, her lips pressed tightly together. As Charles returned to his seat, she couldn't resist a sarcastic remark. "You must have a lot of free time. How about minding your own business instead of bothering others?" she said with a smirk. Charles turned to face her, his calm, steady gaze meeting her defiance head on. "Helping others is never a bother," he replied, his voice low but firm, carrying a weight that silenced the surrounding whispers. Some passengers nearby began to nod in quiet agreement, their expressions supportive. Clara, however, simply let out a dismissive chuckle and pushed her cart further down the aisle. Not long after, another incident occurred. The young son of a single mother seated near Charles accidentally spilled his juice onto the seat. The mother, flustered, scrambled to grab some napkins and clean up the mess, but her efforts weren't quick enough to contain the spill. Clara, standing nearby, immediately turned around, her sharp eyes zeroing in on the commotion. "What is this? Can't you keep your son under control? This is an airplane, not a playground," she snapped, her voice cutting through the cabin like a whip. The mother stammered an apology, her hands trembling as she tried to clean up the spill. Clara wasn't satisfied, her voice growing louder and harsher. "Next time, if you can't manage your child, don't bring him on a flight. This is no place for people who don't know how to behave." Charles couldn't watch in silence any longer. He quietly reached for the napkins on his tray and stood up, walking over to the distressed mother. "Let me help you," he said gently, his voice calm and reassuring. Kneeling down, he carefully wiped the juice off the seat and the floor, his movements deliberate and kind. The mother looked at him, her eyes welling up with tears. "Thank you so much," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Clara stood nearby, arms crossed as she observed the scene, her face a mask of contempt. "You really enjoy playing the hero, don't you?" she sneered. "If you like cleaning so much, maybe you should apply for a job as a janitor." Her venomous words made the air in the cabin feel heavy and tense. A few passengers began to whisper amongst themselves, their dissatisfaction growing louder. Finally, a middle-aged man seated a few rows away stood up, his voice firm as he addressed Clara directly. "You cannot treat passengers this way. This is a flight, not your personal stage to behave unprofessionally." Clara turned to him, her expression one of scorn. "If you don't like the way I do my job, feel free to choose another airline next time," she retorted, her tone dripping with defiance. For a moment, the entire cabin fell into an uneasy silence, but the quiet didn't last long. The murmurs of discontent began to ripple through the rows, and every pair of eyes seemed to turn toward Clara, their collective disapproval unmistakable. Charles returned to his seat, his face calm as ever. Yet there was a glimmer of something sharper in his eyes now, a quiet but unmistakable resolve. What he had witnessed went far beyond mere unprofessionalism. It was blatant discrimination and a lack of basic humanity. It was something he could not and would not overlook. The atmosphere in the economy cabin grew increasingly stifling. After the incident with the single mother, Clara temporarily left the area to continue her duties elsewhere. However, the other passengers who had witnessed everything couldn't help but talk among themselves. Murmurs spread from one row to another, with most expressing dissatisfaction with Clara's behavior. Some passengers couldn't even hide their annoyed glances as she returned to the cabin. Charles remained seated, his calm gaze fixed on Clara. He said nothing, but the serene expression on his face seemed to conceal a deeper thought. The biting remarks and cold demeanor of Clara did not anger him. On the contrary, they seemed to make him more patient, as though he were waiting for something bigger to unfold. Clara re-entered the economy cabin with a new cart, this time laden with trays of food. She moved briskly down the aisle, handing out meals to each passenger. However, her attitude remained unchanged. When she reached Charles's row, she slammed a tray of food down onto the table in front of him without so much as a glance. "Here's your meal. Don't drop it this time," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Charles responded with a gentle, "Thank you," but Clara had already turned her back before he could finish his sentence. His meal tray was sparse: a piece of cold bread, a small cup of water, and a few slices of pre-cut fruit. Charles didn't complain. He merely nodded slightly, his eyes quietly taking in the details. Around him, other passengers noticed the unfairness. They glanced at the meals served to those seated nearer the front of the cabin, which were far more elaborate and appetizing in comparison. An older gentleman seated nearby finally couldn't hold back and spoke up. "Excuse me, but I think there's something wrong with his meal. Why is it different from the others?" Clara spun around, her brows furrowing deeply. "This is the standard for economy class. If you're not satisfied, you're welcome to bring your own food from home. We don't offer custom service for every passenger," she snapped, her tone laced with defiance as though daring anyone to challenge her. The man hesitated, unsure how to respond. He lowered his gaze and fell silent. Charles watched the exchange, and a faint sadness flickered across his face. Slowly, he placed his untouched tray to the side and looked up at Clara, his calm voice cutting through the tense silence. "I don't mean to trouble you," he said warmly, "but isn't your job to ensure the comfort of all passengers?" Clara's lips pressed tightly together as if she were restraining herself from saying something she might regret. But then, unable to hold it in, she let out a dry laugh. "Comfort? Do you think this is a hotel? This is an airplane. You just need to eat what you're given and stop bothering me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with disdain. Around them, passengers exchanged incredulous glances, their dissatisfaction with Clara growing more palpable. Charles, however, maintained his composure, his calm demeanor unshaken. He said nothing further, his steady gaze remaining on Clara, quietly observing, while a sense of unspoken resolve began to take shape. Those words left a few nearby passengers visibly stunned. A young woman sitting close by leaned toward her companion and whispered, "She can't say things like that. It's outrageous." Yet Clara paid no attention to the disapproving glances directed her way, acting as though they didn't exist. As Clara moved further down the aisle, another incident unfolded. A male passenger seated near the back of the cabin accidentally knocked over a bottle of water, which spilled onto the floor, spreading quickly along the aisle. The man hurriedly reached for napkins, attempting to clean up the mess, but the water had already created a sizable puddle. Clara noticed the scene and stormed over, her face a mask of irritation. "What do you think you're doing? Can't you be more careful?" she snapped, her voice sharp and loud enough to draw attention. The man, flustered, tried to explain, "I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. I'll clean it up right away." But Clara wouldn't let it slide. She pointed at him, her voice growing louder and more cutting. "This is exactly why we don't like serving people who don't know how to behave. Do you think this is your living room?" Charles had been quietly observing the entire exchange. Letting out a soft sigh, he set his glass of water down and rose from his seat. "I don't think this situation is as serious as you're making it out to be," he said calmly. "If you could provide a few extra napkins, I'd be happy to help him clean it up." Charles's gentle words caught the attention of several passengers nearby, who turned to look at him with expressions of empathy. Clara, however, glared at him, her disbelief evident. "And who do you think you are, meddling in everything?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "If you're so fond of cleaning, perhaps I can recommend you for a job with the airline." The atmosphere in the cabin immediately grew tense. A few passengers began whispering among themselves, their murmurs growing louder. Finally, a woman stood up, her gaze unwavering as she addressed Clara. "You can't treat us like this. We're passengers, and it's your responsibility to serve us." The woman's firm words drew nods of agreement from several other passengers, their approval silently echoing through the cabin. Clara stood frozen for a moment, her lips pressed tightly together. Instead of responding, she turned abruptly and pushed the food cart toward the back of the cabin, her frustration evident in her hurried movements. The remaining passengers exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. Charles returned to his seat, his face calm and composed, yet in his eyes there was a sharp glint, a hint of cold determination. It seemed as though he had seen enough. After Clara pushed the food cart toward the back of the cabin, the tense atmosphere lingered. Passengers nearby continued murmuring about her rude behavior. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others whispered about reporting her to the airline. Yet, as the whispers grew softer, no one seemed willing to make themselves the center of a confrontation during the flight. Charles remained seated, his fingers gently tapping the armrest of his chair. He said nothing, but his eyes stayed fixed on Clara as she returned from the back of the cabin. Once again, she passed him without a glance, her face still radiating self-assured arrogance. Suddenly, another incident broke the uneasy silence. A young woman, likely in her early 30s, seated in the same row as Charles, accidentally dropped her handbag into the aisle while trying to pull her carry-on bag from under her seat. The contents of her bag spilled out, scattering across the floor. The woman, clearly flustered, bent down quickly, attempting to gather her belongings, but the cramped space only made the task more difficult. Clara, passing by at that moment, immediately noticed the scene. "What are you doing?" Clara snapped, her sharp tone freezing the woman in place. "Do you realize you're blocking the aisle?" The young woman looked up, her face red with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I'll clean it up right away," she stammered. Before she could finish, Clara cut her off, pointing at the scattered items with an accusatory finger. "If you can't manage to keep your things organized, maybe you should leave them at home. This is an airplane, not your personal storage space." Clara's voice grew louder, her words brimming with irritation. The woman's face turned crimson as she hurriedly bent down to pick up her belongings. Around them, other passengers looked on with clear disapproval. A few whispered among themselves, but none dared to step in. Charles, however, couldn't remain silent. Rising from his seat, he moved toward the woman. Kneeling down, he began picking up some of her scattered items, his warm smile easing the tension. "It's all right," he said, his deep, soothing voice cutting through the unease. "We all make mistakes sometimes." The woman glanced up at him, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you so much," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Clara, standing nearby with her arms crossed, watched the scene unfold, her expression darkening with visible annoyance. "Oh, meddling in other people's business again, are we?" she sneered. "I don't know who you think you are, but on this flight, I'm the one in charge." Her voice carried a sharp edge of defiance, and murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Many passengers exchanged glances of frustration, their dissatisfaction becoming harder to suppress. A man seated across the aisle from Charles finally spoke up, his tone firm and unyielding. "Don't you think your behavior is over the line? He's simply helping someone in need. That's something we should all be doing." Clara turned to him, her eyes narrowing as if preparing to reprimand him as well. "If you don't like the way I do my job, feel free to choose another airline next time," she said coldly. "Now sit down and stop wasting my time." The cabin fell into a heavy silence, but only for a moment. The murmurs among the passengers grew into louder whispers, and disapproving gazes from all directions landed squarely on Clara. Charles, still kneeling, handed the last of the items back to the young woman before returning to his seat. His expression remained calm, but the flicker of stern determination in his eyes hinted that he had seen more than enough. He sat back, his composed demeanor intact, but inside something was shifting. Those words were the final straw. The economy cabin plunged into an uneasy silence, heavy with tension. Yet moments later, whispers of discontent began to ripple through the rows. An elderly woman seated near the front turned to her neighbor and muttered, "I can't believe she said that. How unprofessional." Charles maintained his composure. He returned to his seat, inhaling deeply as if centering himself. However, the warmth that had once lit his gaze was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. What he had witnessed went far beyond poor work ethic. It was blatant disrespect for human dignity. He calmly picked up his empty glass from the tray table, took a small sip of water, and fixed his eyes on Clara with a steady, unwavering gaze. After a moment, Charles reached out and pressed the call button. Clara, standing near the back of the cabin, noticed the signal but made no effort to approach immediately. Instead, she moved slowly, her displeasure evident in the deliberate pace of her steps. When she finally reached his seat, she folded her arms and leaned forward slightly, her tone icy. "What is it now? What do you need this time?" she asked sharply. Charles placed the empty glass on the tray table in front of him, his voice calm and measured. "I'm feeling a bit thirsty. Could you bring me another glass of water? Clara's lips twisted into a mocking smirk. Water? Do you think this is some kind of cafe? I don't have time to keep waiting on you. Charles met her mocking gaze with steady eyes, his tone still composed but carrying an unmistakable firmness. I believe your job is to serve all passengers on this flight, isn't it? His words caught the attention of nearby passengers. A few nodded in quiet agreement, their discontent with Clara becoming increasingly visible. Clara, however, let out a derisive chuckle, her arrogance unabated. Sure, but not for people like you. Take care of yourself, she retorted, her words dripping with disdain. Her statement froze the cabin in stunned silence. The air grew thick with tension, as if time itself had stopped. Passengers exchanged glances of disbelief, their murmurs growing louder as they began discussing whether to report her behavior to the airline. Charles, however, remained calm, though his gaze sharpened. His mind seemed to be working through a calculated decision, weighing the gravity of the situation. Without saying another word, Charles leaned back in his seat, his expression unchanging. Yet, the subtle smile playing on his lips carried an unsettling sense of purpose, one that made Clara uneasy in a way she couldn't quite understand. The flight moved deeper into its course, yet the tension in the economy cabin showed no signs of easing. Clara, still exuding arrogance and coldness, continued to wield her perceived authority over the passengers. Those seated near Charles began to feel the oppressive atmosphere, with each of Clara's trips down the aisle leaving a trail of discomfort. Each time she passed, passengers averted their eyes, unwilling to risk becoming her next target. Charles remained quietly in his seat, his calm expression unchanging. Yet inside, he took in every detail. Every word, every glance, and every gesture Clara made. He observed her closely, as though he were gathering all the pieces of a puzzle for something significant. Suddenly, another incident broke the uneasy stillness. A young man seated a few rows away from Charles pressed the call button. He wore a simple yet clean jacket, his demeanor polite but slightly anxious. When Clara approached, her face already showed signs of irritation. "What do you need?" she asked curtly, her tone devoid of any warmth. The young man looked up, his cheeks slightly flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, but my seatbelt is stuck. I can't get it off. Could you help me, please?" Clara sighed audibly and placed her hands on her hips. "Fine, but can't you handle something this small on your own?" she retorted. She bent down and yanked the seatbelt forcefully, startling the man with her brusque manner. "There. Next time, deal with it yourself," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Charles, watching the exchange, furrowed his brow slightly. Around him, a few passengers exchanged whispers, their disapproval clear. The young man lowered his head and mumbled a quiet thank you before retreating into his seat. Clara straightened up, her eyes darting toward Charles as if daring him to react. He met her gaze, offering nothing but a slight, enigmatic smile, a smile that seemed to unsettle her. Not long after, Charles pressed the call button. Clara, who was near the back of the cabin, noticed the signal but didn't hurry to respond. Instead, she walked slowly, her displeasure evident in her deliberate pace. When she finally reached him, she crossed her arms and leaned slightly toward him, her voice sharp. "What now? What do you want this time?" she asked, her tone laced with mockery. Charles gently placed his empty glass on the table before him, his voice steady and polite. "I apologize for troubling you, but may I have another glass of water? I'm feeling a bit thirsty." Clara's lips curled into a smirk as she let out a dismissive chuckle. "Water? Who do you think you are, calling me over for every little thing? This is an airplane, not a restaurant. I'm not your servant," she snapped, loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. A middle-aged woman seated nearby shook her head in disbelief, turning to whisper to her companion, "Unbelievable. She can't speak to a passenger like that." Charles's tone remained calm, his demeanor unfazed. "I only asked for a glass of water. It's a basic need, isn't it?" Clara scoffed, her eyes narrowing with defiance. "Basic need? If you want basic needs, you should stay home. This is an airplane, not a place where you can get whatever you want." Her words hung heavily in the air, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The silence that followed was thick, charged with discomfort and outrage. A few passengers exchanged looks of disbelief, their murmurs growing louder as their collective disapproval mounted. Charles sat back in his seat, his expression calm but his gaze sharp. His actions and demeanor suggested that he was calculating something, quietly preparing for what was to come. Without raising his voice or showing visible anger, he exuded a quiet power that made Clara, for the first time, falter slightly, though she tried to maintain her facade of control. The tension in the economy cabin reached a boiling point. Several passengers began voicing their dissatisfaction more openly. A man seated across the aisle stood up, his voice loud and filled with anger. "You can't treat him like that. This is a flight, and it's your job to serve the passengers." Clara spun around sharply, her eyes blazing as she glared at the man. "If you don't like the way I do my job, feel free to choose another airline next time. Now sit down and stop bothering me." Her words were the final straw. A few other passengers began speaking up as well, creating a ripple of protest that spread throughout the cabin. Yet Clara, with her haughty demeanor, showed no sign of backing down. Instead, she directed her frustration squarely at Charles, as though he were the cause of all her problems. "Do you have anything else to say? If not, let me get back to my work," she said, her tone dripping with disdain and challenge. Charles met her glare with calm, steady eyes, his expression unshaken. Slowly, he rose from his seat, his gaze sweeping across the economy cabin. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured but carried the weight of authority. "I don't think asking for a glass of water is an unreasonable request," he began, his words slicing through the noise. "But it seems that good service isn't part of your definition of this job." His words hung in the air, silencing the cabin for a moment. Clara let out a derisive laugh, but there was a flicker of unease in her expression. "Who do you think you are to tell me how to do my job?" she snapped, her voice louder than before, though it wavered slightly. Charles didn't respond immediately. He sat back down, his calm demeanor unbroken, but the faint smile on his lips carried an air of quiet certainty. It was as if he held a secret that no one else was yet privy to. Around them, passengers exchanged curious glances, beginning to suspect that Charles was far from an ordinary traveler. Clara, meanwhile, stood frozen in place, the weight of the growing discontent around her slowly pressing down. But rather than address it, she turned away, pretending to carry on with her duties, unaware that the next chapter of this flight was about to unfold in a way she could never have anticipated. Clara stood frozen, her piercing gaze locked on Charles as if she could punish him for daring to speak out in front of the entire cabin. But before she could retort, another unexpected situation unfolded. A young passenger seated near the back of the cabin accidentally knocked a suitcase out of the overhead compartment. The bag tumbled down, narrowly missing the shoulder of another passenger. Gasps rippled through the nearby rows as Clara stormed toward the scene, her face twisted in frustration. "What is this? Can't you keep your belongings in order? Do you even realize this is an airplane?" she snapped, her sharp tone making the young man flinch. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I'll put it back right away," he stammered, scrambling to lift the suitcase. Clara, however, refused to let the matter end there. Crossing her arms, she raised her voice further. "Sorry? You think a simple sorry is enough? If you can't manage your luggage, maybe you shouldn't be flying at all." Passengers exchanged shocked and frustrated glances, their unease growing. An elderly woman nearby spoke up, her voice steady but firm. "You don't need to scold him like that. It was just an accident." Clara spun around, her expression filled with disdain as she glared at the woman. "If you're unhappy with how I'm handling things, feel free to take over my job. Otherwise, sit down and let me do my work." Her words landed like a slap in the already tense atmosphere of the economy cabin. Charles quietly rose from his seat and approached the chaotic scene. Without a word, he bent down and helped the young man lift the suitcase back into the overhead bin, his movements calm and deliberate. Once the bag was secure, he turned to face Clara, his expression composed, but his voice commanding. "You need to remember that we are passengers, and it is your responsibility to ensure that we feel comfortable on this flight," he said, his tone low but resolute. Clara's eyes flickered with defiance, her expression hardening. "And who do you think you are? Telling me how to do my job? I've been doing this for over 10 years, and I know exactly what I need to do," she snapped, her voice sharp with indignation. Charles tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady and unyielding. 10 years of experience, yet it seems you've forgotten the most important value of this job, respecting others, no matter who they are. The entire cabin fell into silence, the tension palpable. Passengers around them watched intently, captivated by the unfolding confrontation as if it were a dramatic play. Clara let out a derisive chuckle, her lips pressed into a thin line. She took a step closer to Charles, her voice rising as she spoke, laced with challenge and hostility. "Oh, really? And who are you to lecture me about respect?" she sneered, her words dripping with scorn. "You're such a nuisance. If you don't like the way I do my job, you're welcome to get off this plane right now." Clara's words left everyone in the cabin stunned. A few passengers let out audible sighs of frustration, while others began whispering among themselves, their discontent growing louder. Charles didn't react immediately. He stood still, his steady gaze fixed on Clara as though he were trying to read her thoughts. "Do you truly believe you have the authority to remove anyone from this flight?" he asked, his tone calm yet razor sharp. Clara smirked, her lips curling into a mocking smile. "Yes, I do. I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight, and I have the power to make all the decisions." At that moment, another passenger, a middle-aged man seated near the front, stood up. "That's not true. As passengers, we have the right to be treated with respect. Your behavior is absolutely unacceptable," he said firmly. His words were met with nods of agreement from several other passengers, some even clapping softly to show their support. Clara's composure began to crack. "If you all don't like it, I'll call security to handle every single one of you," she snapped, her voice nearly shouting as her eyes darted around the cabin, attempting to intimidate the growing unrest. Charles sighed deeply, his demeanor still calm and collected. He sat back down slowly and spoke in an even tone, his words carrying the weight of quiet authority. "You've been doing this job for over 10 years, yet it seems you've forgotten that respect is the foundation of all service. Perhaps you need a reminder of that." His words weren't just directed at Clara. They resonated through the cabin, carrying a powerful message to every passenger. Clara opened her mouth to retort, but froze when her eyes landed on a passenger near the front, holding up their phone and recording the entire exchange. For a brief moment, her face turned pale, the realization of the situation sinking in. She quickly masked her unease with a forced smile. "Well, if no one else has anything to say, I'll return to my duties," she said, her voice lower but still tinged with arrogance. Charles remained silent, but a glimmer of steel shone in his eyes. He knew the situation was far from over, and whether Clara realized it or not, she was on the verge of facing the greatest lesson of her life. As the plane landed, the soft afternoon sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, casting long shadows of the passengers. Clara stood at the front of the cabin, adjusting her uniform, attempting to reclaim the composure and authority she had displayed throughout the flight. Though she remained silent, the dissatisfaction radiating from the passengers was palpable. A few glances still followed her, filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. Charles rose from his seat, slowly retrieving his worn suitcase from beneath his chair. He moved unhurriedly, maintaining the same calm demeanor he had displayed throughout the journey. Yet, what he was about to do would alter the oppressive atmosphere entirely. As the passengers began filing out of the plane, Charles strolled toward the front of the cabin where Clara was standing. Those nearby seemed to pause, their curiosity piqued as they watched him. Clara spotted his approach and forced a stiff smile, though the unease in her eyes betrayed her. "What do you want now?" "The flight's over," she said, her tone tinged with thinly veiled arrogance. Charles stood tall, meeting her gaze directly. "I think we're about to have an interesting conversation," he said, his voice warm yet carrying an undeniable authority. Clara hesitated, visibly thrown off for a moment, but quickly regained her confidence. "If you have a complaint, I can forward it to the airline management, but for now, I need to get back to my duties." Charles didn't respond. Instead, he offered a faint smile and calmly walked past her, heading toward the cockpit door where the pilots and senior airline staff had gathered. Moments later, a sharply dressed man in a tailored suit emerged from the doorway. He strode directly toward Charles and extended his hand in a gesture of utmost respect. "Mr. Morgan, welcome back. We're ready for the meeting," the man said, his voice ringing clearly through the suddenly silent cabin. The remaining passengers, Clara included, froze in place. The air seemed to shift as realization dawned on the group. A few passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. Clara stood rooted to the spot, her face pale as she stared at Charles. The man she had dismissed, insulted, and belittled throughout the flight was none other than the owner of the airline. Clara stood frozen, her eyes wide and her face pale. "Mr. Morgan?" she stammered, unable to believe what she had just heard. She looked at Charles, the man she had treated as though he were a poor and insignificant traveler throughout the flight. Yet now, he stood before her with the composure and authority of someone in power, greeted by the airline's management as a revered guest. Charles turned to face her, his calm eyes meeting hers. "Yes, I am Charles Morgan, the owner of this airline. I took this flight not for leisure, but to observe how my staff treats the passengers." His words struck like a bolt of lightning in the silent cabin. The surrounding passengers began murmuring immediately, nodding as the entire story started to make sense. A woman whispered to her husband, "I can't believe he's the owner. That's truly admirable." Clara's legs nearly gave out beneath her. Cold sweat formed on her forehead as the realization dawned. "Mr. Morgan, I didn't know," she stuttered, fumbling for an excuse. But Charles raised a hand, signaling her to stop. "There's no need for explanations. I saw everything. Not just how you treated me, but how you treated other passengers. It's truly disheartening to see someone in the service industry forget the core value of their work." Clara bowed her head, unable to muster a response. Charles turned to the airline's executive, his voice firm. "I want her suspended immediately. Additionally, I want a company-wide training session to remind all staff about the importance of respect and responsibility in this job." The executive nodded without hesitation. "Yes, Mr. Morgan, we'll take care of it right away." Clara lifted her tear-filled eyes, her voice trembling. "Mr. Morgan, I'm truly sorry. I made a mistake." Charles looked at her, his expression free of anger but also void of immediate forgiveness. "I don't want to ruin your career, but I do want you to understand that every action has consequences. Learn from this mistake if you want to continue in this line of work." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Bowing her head, she realized she had just received the most valuable and humbling lesson of her life. As Charles exited the plane, the other passengers rose to their feet, applauding him. A few even stepped forward to thank him, not just for his humility, but for how he had handled the situation with calmness and fairness. Before stepping through the door, Charles turned back to address the remaining passengers. "I hope your next flight will be better. And remember, respect is something that should never be lacking anywhere." Charles's words left a profound silence in the cabin, a silence of reflection and understanding. The passengers watched as he stepped off the plane, his calm demeanor and powerful message lingering in everyone's minds. Clara stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, a reminder that even in mistakes, there is always an opportunity to learn and change. This story reminds us of the importance of respect, humility, and the consequences of our actions. Whether in the skies or on the ground, how we treat others defines who we are. What would you have done if you were in Charles's position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Remember, even a little kindness can change everything. Thank you for watching.